What if the Queen, always poised, always polite, had a silent enemies list? No headlines, no drama, just 6 names, quietly iced out behind palace walls. They smiled in public. She smiled back. But behind the pearls and protocol, Queen Elizabeth II harbored a lifetime of quiet fury for those who embarrassed, betrayed, or simply irritated her beyond royal repair. These weren't outbursts. They were erasures. And tonight, we're opening the vault, because even a monarch trained in silence still had her limits. This is 6 royals Queen Elizabeth hated the most. Before we slip behind the velvet curtain of royal grudges, make sure you're subscribed. This channel dives deep into the secrets history never says out loud. And while we're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you're listening to this? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who else is wandering the halls of royal mystery with us tonight. 1. Wallis Simpson. She was the woman who didn't just walk into a palace. She kicked the door open, knocked over the china, and took the king with her on the way out. Twice divorced, American, and pointedly unimpressed with British etiquette, Wallis Simpson wasn't just an outsider. She was the royal family's worst-case scenario made flesh. And for Queen Elizabeth II, who spent a lifetime turning her own emotions into porcelain masks, Wallis was everything she was raised to avoid, which is probably why, for the next 6 decades, she treated her with the kind of icy indifference that makes frostbite seem affectionate. Let's rewind to the original catastrophe, 1936. A bored king, Edward VIII, falls in love with Wallis, a woman who, according to court gossip, had a voice like a smoke-damaged phonograph and a sense of humor no one inside Buckingham Palace found remotely amusing. The British government warned him. The church frowned. The family panicked. And Edward, undeterred, abdicated the throne in the name of love, or, as some royal insiders described it, an emotional tantrum in formal wear. That decision changed everything. Had Edward remained king, Elizabeth would have likely lived a quiet life in the periphery of royal duty, wealthy, sure, but anonymous by comparison. But Wallis's arrival created a vacuum of duty that had to be filled. It pushed her father, the painfully reluctant and chronically ill George VI, onto the throne. It pulled her mother into permanent emotional overdrive. And it hurled a 10-year-old Elizabeth into a future she had never asked for. Wallis was never forgiven for that, not in any explicit way, of course. Elizabeth II was the master of quiet retribution. No fiery speeches, no public jabs, just the subtle, almost surgical art of social exile. When Wallis and Edward, the self-styled Duke and Duchess of Windsor, attempted to engage with the royal family after the abdication, they were received like forgotten coats in a hallway, technically acknowledged but studiously ignored. Wallis, for her part, didn't help. She reportedly referred to the royal family as the firm, with an air of amused contempt, and viewed most of the Windsors as stuffy relics. At parties in Paris, she would mock their mannerisms, mimic their accents, and privately joke about how boring they all were. Word got back, as it always does, especially in royal circles, where revenge is a matter of paperwork, not passion. When Elizabeth finally ascended the throne in 1952, the relationship grew colder. Wallis and Edward, then living in a kind of stylish exile in France, were not invited to major royal events. Their requests to visit were often delayed, redirected, or mysteriously misplaced. When Elizabeth did meet Wallis, it was almost always brief, carefully choreographed, and drenched in formality so thick it could smother an opera singer. One biographer noted that the Queen would schedule meetings with Wallis down to the minute, 10 minutes, never 12, and would look at the clock before even sitting down. The message wasn't subtle. I am here because protocol demands it, not because you are welcome. There's also the matter of the funeral. When Edward died in 1972, the Queen allowed him to be buried at Frogmore, the royal burial ground, beside a spot reserved for Wallis. It was a gesture of mercy, perhaps, but not warmth. She met Wallis at the funeral. They exchanged words. Some say a few polite phrases. Others claim it was entirely silent. Either way, there were no embraces. No shared grief. Just a queen doing her duty for a man who once abandoned his. Behind the civility was a lifetime of frost. Because Wallis didn't just fall in love with the wrong man. She dismantled an entire future Elizabeth had quietly imagined. She made duty look weak. She made monarchy look negotiable. And worst of all, she made the Queen's own path feel like the result of someone else's selfishness. Wallis lived to be 89. She died in 1986 after years of illness and obscurity. The Queen did not attend the funeral. She sent a representative. It's ironic, really. Wallis was once at the center of the world's most scandalous love story. But in the end, she was little more than a ghost in Elizabeth's rearview mirror. Acknowledged, but barely. And yet, her legacy didn't die with her. Because the very idea of a royal giving up everything for love, it lingered. It haunted. And eventually it showed up again, this time inside the Queen's own bloodline. 2. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. If Wallis Simpson was the spark, Edward was the gasoline. The man born to be king, but who instead became the monarchy's greatest administrative headache, lived the rest of his life under the shadow of the throne he gave up. For Queen Elizabeth II, his niece Edward wasn't just a rogue relative with poor judgment. He was the living embodiment of everything she was taught to resist: indulgence, self-pity, public vanity, and above all, the temptation to choose personal freedom over institutional duty. Of course, she was never supposed to become queen in the first place. That was Edward's job. But after less than a year on the throne, and a suspiciously dramatic flirtation with the idea of being both monarch and husband to a twice-divorced American, he abdicated in 1936. The fallout wasn't just political. It was nuclear. His decision sent the royal household into a multi-decade identity crisis, forced Elizabeth's shy, chain-smoking father into a crown he neither wanted nor enjoyed, and permanently branded Edward as the king who couldn't handle the job. Elizabeth grew up watching the emotional toll it took on her parents. The public pressure, the private pain. Her father, George VI, never forgave Edward. The Queen Mother loathed him. And Elizabeth, absorbing it all from the sidelines, developed a quiet, ice-water distaste that never fully thawed. Even after the war, when Edward had receded into a kind of polite Parisian exile with Wallis in a house stuffed with furniture and resentment, he remained a problem, an expensive one. His allowance was paid by the crown. His title still made headlines. And worse, he kept talking. The Duke of Windsor gave interviews, wrote memoirs, sent letters that read more like passive-aggressive memoirs, and most damningly, maintained a public tone of breezy superiority toward the monarchy he left behind. He never stopped implying that he'd had the better deal. That choosing Wallis over Westminster had somehow been a noble act. Romantic, even. The Queen was not amused. And then there were the rumors. Less like rumors, more like heavily footnoted embarrassments. Edward's alleged Nazi sympathies during the 1930s. His meeting with Hitler in 1937. The intelligence reports that suggested he had, at one point, expressed interest in a German-backed restoration of his rule. Conspiratorial? Perhaps. But enough to alarm Churchill, disgust his own family, and confirm what Elizabeth had always quietly feared. Edward wasn't just careless. He was dangerous. She treated him accordingly. Throughout her reign, the Queen maintained an unshakably formal relationship with her uncle. Visits were rare and joyless. Invitations to major royal events were either quietly withheld or buried beneath a mountain of protocol. When he did visit the UK, it was with the energy of a tax audit. Polite, tense, and extremely well documented. One staffer once noted that the Queen could go an entire weekend without speaking to the Duke directly, even if they were staying in the same residence. But she never publicly condemned him. That wasn't her style. Elizabeth II mastered the art of emotional bureaucracy, freezing someone out without ever raising her voice or even appearing upset. To the public, it looked like dignity. To insiders, it was punishment in pearls. When Edward fell ill in the early 1970s, the Queen did visit, briefly. She was cordial, even gracious, but not warm. And when he died in 1972, she allowed him a burial in royal grounds, next to the woman for whom he'd gambled the crown. Again, it was duty, not forgiveness. The monarchy had a way of making funerals look like generosity. And yet, Edward's shadow never quite left the room. His choice, abdication for love, became a cautionary tale wrapped in royal velvet. Elizabeth ruled for decades with the opposite philosophy: duty first, always. In many ways, her entire reign was an extended rebuttal to his. Where he surrendered, she endured. Where he sought escape, she found containment. But there's something more personal there too, something that feels less institutional, more human. Edward didn't just derail the monarchy, he rerouted her life. Because of him, a young girl was thrust into the role of heir, forced to spend her adolescence memorizing ceremonial protocol and public diplomacy instead of learning how to be ordinary. His failure became her beginning. And in the Queen's long, silent disapproval, there was something colder than hatred, something that looked a lot like mourning for the life she might have had if her uncle had simply done his job. But as history would have it, the royal family wasn't quite finished with ideological sparring partners. Because decades later, the Queen would meet a woman who didn't just challenge her worldview, but governed the country under it. If you're still with us, 2 royals down and the tension's already thick enough to cut with a corgi whistle, don't forget to subscribe for more stories the palace would rather keep buried. And while you're here, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you deep into the night with us, or sneaking a royal scandal on your lunch break? We see you. 3. Margaret Thatcher. In the great British tradition of uncomfortable pairings, fish and custard, lukewarm tea and rebellion, few matched the exquisite tension of Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. On paper, they should have made sense. 2 powerful women leading the United Kingdom through a rapidly changing world. But behind palace doors and number 10 briefings, they were like 2 clock mechanisms wound in opposite directions. Precise, relentless, and constantly grinding against one another. It wasn't hatred. That word is too messy for Buckingham Palace. This was something quieter, stiffer, a cold ideological stare that neither woman blinked first in. Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister in 1979, the first woman to hold the post in British history. The Queen, already decades into her reign, had seen prime ministers come and go like train conductors. Polite, dutiful, usually deferential. But Thatcher was different. She didn't defer. She didn't soften. And, most unnervingly for the Queen, she didn't bend. They were both children of wartime Britain. But where Elizabeth learned stability, silence, and ceremonial poise, Thatcher learned grit, self-reliance, and the hard-edged logic of markets. One was born into duty, the other clawed her way into power. And it showed. The Queen's aides, who rarely leak anything unless it's intentional, began quietly reporting tensions within the first year of Thatcher's term. There were eye rolls, cool silences, awkward pauses at state dinners that even the cutlery seemed to notice. Thatcher arrived early to meetings and launched straight into policy, while Elizabeth preferred a slower, more personal tempo. Thatcher gave speeches with military cadence. The Queen preferred velvet diplomacy. And then came the Commonwealth fracture. In the 1980s, the Queen, normally a figure of political neutrality, found herself deeply uncomfortable with Thatcher's refusal to support sanctions against apartheid South Africa. Most of the Commonwealth was in favor. Thatcher, stubborn as ever, saw it as political posturing and bad economics. The Queen saw it as a moral failure. For a monarch whose entire brand rested on maintaining unity and quiet dignity, Thatcher's approach was jarringly blunt. At a 1986 Commonwealth Summit in the Bahamas, things nearly boiled over. Reports suggest that Elizabeth was dismayed by Thatcher's resistance and exasperated by her tone. Strong words, by Windsor standards. A senior courtier allegedly leaked that the Queen was worried Thatcher was making Britain look heartless on the world stage. The palace later denied the quote, which of course confirmed it. But the differences ran deeper than foreign policy. Thatcher governed like a sledgehammer in pearls. She loathed consensus politics. She gutted unions. She privatized entire industries with the delicacy of a demolition crew. Elizabeth, by contrast, had spent her life mastering the slow art of not rocking the boat. For every prime minister who'd walked the careful line between policy and tradition, Thatcher marched straight across it, leaving press clippings and backbench rebellions in her wake. Even socially, they clashed. The Queen liked country life, dogs, horses, and emotional understatement. Thatcher, a grocer's daughter turned political titan, despised leisure. She reportedly stayed up late rewriting her own speeches and treated holidays as offensive suggestions. During weekends at Balmoral, where royals hunted, hiked, and observed the time-honored tradition of not talking too much, Thatcher would show up overdressed, overprepared, and utterly incapable of pretending to enjoy casual conversation. Their staff noticed. According to various biographies, palace aides dreaded the Queen Thatcher meetings, which were required weekly by constitutional convention. While never openly confrontational, the air was reportedly so tense you could cut it with a butter knife, if Thatcher hadn't already cut the butter herself and reorganized the tray. Still, despite the friction, both women performed their roles with impeccable discipline. In public there was no visible rift. They smiled when required, posed together, and toasted each other with the forced grace of co-workers at a mandatory retirement party. But under the surface, the Queen simply didn't like her. Not in a political sense. Elizabeth rarely expressed personal preferences on policy, but Thatcher's abrasiveness, her intolerance for compromise, her relentless image of the self-made crusader, it grated against everything the Queen understood monarchy to be. To rule without spectacle, to speak without drama, to lead quietly from behind a veil of continuity. Thatcher was the opposite, and in the Queen's eyes, perhaps the most unforgivable trait. She thought she knew better. When Thatcher finally resigned in 1990, pushed out by her own party, the Queen reportedly showed subtle relief, according to insiders. She sent a courteous note, observed the expected rituals, and moved on. But even decades later, Elizabeth never quite rewrote the story. She awarded Thatcher the Order of Merit, as custom demanded. She attended her funeral, as a head of state should. But the warmth was never there. Because Thatcher may have been the Iron Lady, but the Queen understood something deeper. Iron rusts when it forgets how to bend. And just as she had with Edward and Wallis, Elizabeth watched another forceful personality try to mold the world to their will, and quietly outlasted them. But power doesn't always come from the throne or the ballot box. Sometimes it arrives from inside the family itself, and sometimes it comes dressed as an uncle. 4. Lord Louis Mountbatten. Later years. To the outside world, Lord Louis Mountbatten was the royal family's most glamorous war hero, a naval officer, statesman, kingmaker, and beloved uncle to Prince Philip. To the inner sanctum, though, especially in the Queen's later dealings with him, he was a high-functioning meddler. Charming, yes. Decorated, certainly. But also a man whose talent for strategic affection came with an unfortunate side effect. He rarely knew when to stop. Queen Elizabeth II once regarded Mountbatten with real admiration. He was the bridge between empires, the last Viceroy of India, the orchestrator of Charles's early upbringing, and a guiding hand in countless royal affairs. He called her Lilibet. He was family. But the warmth cooled. Gradually, then permanently. Because Mountbatten had a habit of treating the royal family like a chessboard, and Elizabeth, pointedly, had no interest in being one of his pieces. The trouble began, as it often did, with Prince Charles. Mountbatten saw himself as a mentor to the young prince, offering advice on everything from naval service to personal conduct. His letters to Charles were equal parts affection and instruction, laced with a paternal tone that sometimes drifted into control. He urged Charles to sow wild oats before settling down. Hardly scandalous in theory, but not the sort of thing the Queen appreciated seeing in writing. Especially from a family member whose relationship with privacy was, at best, conditional. Worse still, Mountbatten played matchmaker, and not the whimsical Bridgerton kind. He believed it was his duty to steer Charles toward what he saw as a suitable marriage, code for someone aristocratic, well-bred, and strategically advantageous. At one point, he allegedly pushed for Charles to marry his own granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull. It didn't take, but the effort wasn't forgotten. The Queen, trained in the art of constitutional non-interference, viewed this sort of manipulation as deeply inappropriate. She valued discretion. Mountbatten, on the other hand, believed in shaping destiny, preferably by letter, speech, or unsolicited advice during dinner. Even in political matters, he often overstepped. After retiring from active service, Mountbatten didn't retire from influence. He gave interviews, offered public commentary on military matters, and never fully detached himself from the idea that he was essential to the function of Britain itself. Some saw him as a stabilizing elder statesman. The Queen saw him, increasingly, as a liability with a naval rank. And then there were the whispers, Mountbatten advising other family members behind the Queen's back, lobbying senior politicians privately, and operating with a kind of unofficial authority that Elizabeth neither invited nor appreciated. For a monarch who prized structure and subtlety, Mountbatten's behind-the-scenes engineering felt like a betrayal in slow motion. By the late 1970s, their relationship was polite but distant. He remained involved in family events, still held in regard by many, but the Queen kept her boundaries clear. There was no public falling out. There never is. But those close to the family observed that Elizabeth no longer took his counsel as seriously. She had, in her way, withdrawn. Mountbatten's assassination in 1979 was a national tragedy. The Queen responded with solemn dignity, attended the funeral, and delivered the expected tributes. But insiders noticed the speech lacked personal intimacy. It was appropriate, respectful. But unlike her tributes to others, there was no warm nostalgia, no private memory shared, just the facts, dressed in black. In truth, Mountbatten had become one of those figures the Queen distrusted most, someone who used personal closeness as a form of leverage. He had meant to help, perhaps, but he also believed, fundamentally, that he knew better. About Charles, about the monarchy, even at times about Elizabeth herself. That was his mistake, because for all her softness in speech, the Queen was not easily guided. She had lived through too many crises, survived too many overconfident men with plans. And she had learned something that Mountbatten never quite accepted. The monarchy endures not through manipulation, but through restraint. In the end, she kept him in the family, but not in the circle. And while Mountbatten may have tried to engineer the future of the crown, the next threat to its image was already in motion, not from a naval officer or a statesman, but from within the House of Windsor itself, not with letters, but with glances, not through politics, but through scandal. 5. Camilla Parker Bowles, before the marriage. Long before she was the Queen Consort, before public rehabilitation campaigns and awkward photo ops at garden parties, Camilla Parker Bowles was simply the woman Queen Elizabeth II did not want to talk about. At least, not out loud. For years, she was referred to in palace corridors with the kind of verbal footnotes usually reserved for minor diplomatic errors. Her. That woman. Or, when the Queen was especially irritated, nothing at all. A silence that spoke volumes. Because in Elizabeth's world, if you couldn't be discreet, you could at least be invisible. Camilla had, in the Queen's view, done something far worse than be scandalous. She had been disruptive. The relationship between Charles and Camilla began long before Diana was even in the picture. It simmered beneath the surface, immune to royal protocol and inconveniently immune to fading. Camilla was married. Charles was expected to marry someone young, virginal, photogenic, and above all, vaguely mythical in public perception. Enter Diana, and then, inevitably, exit any hope of emotional clarity. When the affair between Charles and Camilla went from whispered suspicion to international tabloid theater, the Queen didn't rage. She recoiled. The monarchy, already limping through the 1990s with its popularity battered by scandal, divorce, and the slow-burning crisis of modern relevance, could not afford a mistress in tweed taking center stage. Camilla was not just controversial, she was deeply inconvenient. The Queen, who had spent her reign projecting marital duty and emotional discipline, now found herself presiding over a public family drama that felt more like a soap opera than a sovereign institution. And while Charles was her son, Elizabeth did not grant him automatic absolution. She believed in appearances, in sacrifice, in holding one's tongue and doing one's job. And what she saw in the Charles-Camilla affair was recklessness, emotional and reputational. Reports from the time suggest she refused to meet Camilla for years. Invitations were extended to Charles, but not to her. At formal events, the Queen maintained the sort of rigid etiquette that made it clear. This was not acceptance. This was management. The royal family didn't even officially acknowledge the relationship until the early 2000s. And the Queen famously refused to attend Charles and Camilla's civil wedding ceremony in 2005. She showed up for the blessing afterward, a strategic compromise that said, "I'll tolerate this, but only in God's house." In private, her disapproval was less about moral outrage and more about royal consequence. Camilla represented chaos. She reminded the Queen of Wallis Simpson, another woman who had pulled a future king off course. And like Wallis, Camilla seemed to get what she wanted without asking permission. But the monarchy, as Elizabeth saw it, was never about personal desire. It was about control, and Camilla, for too long, had represented everything the Queen could not control. Of course, time has a way of softening edges. Public opinion turned. Charles and Camilla married. Camilla took on royal duties with quiet efficiency. But Elizabeth's acceptance came slowly, grudgingly, and only after it was politically inevitable. In the end, the Queen did what she always did, endured, smiled for the cameras, adapted. But the years of cold distance, the formal silences, and the tactical absences all left their imprint. Because long before Camilla became respectable, she had already committed her worst crime in the Queen's eyes, making a mess of the family business. And just as the monarchy began to patch itself back together, the Queen's next adversary arrived, not in pearls nor in scandal, but with a winning smile and a modern haircut. 6. Tony Blair. Of all the people who irritated Queen Elizabeth II, Tony Blair might be the most fascinating, not because he was the worst offender, but because he never quite realized he was offending her at all. Unlike Wallis Simpson or Margaret Thatcher, Blair didn't clash with the Queen on morality or policy. Not directly. No, Blair's true offense was spiritual. He treated the monarchy like a brand that needed a reboot. He arrived at number 10 in 1997 like a rock star in a tailored suit, young, articulate, charismatic, and utterly uninterested in old-world ritual. The Queen, who had reigned through 10 prime ministers already, quickly sensed something different. Blair wasn't deferential. He was enthusiastic. He used phrases like "cool Britannia." He hosted parties with celebrities. He wanted Britain to feel modern, urgent, global. And he saw the royal family as a kind of institutional antique that needed strategic polishing. The Queen was, by then, an expert in political neutrality. But neutrality doesn't mean indifference. And Blair's style made her teeth itch. Things came to a quiet boil after the death of Princess Diana. The country erupted in public mourning. Crowds gathered. The media demanded statements. The Queen in Balmoral followed royal protocol, privacy first, public second. But Blair saw a moment and seized it. He gave his now famous speech calling Diana the people's princess, branding her legacy with a tagline that would stick like glitter. The Queen reportedly found it opportunistic, theatrical, and, not insignificantly, done without consulting the palace. It was the beginning of a long, slow freeze. She disliked his showmanship, his tendency to use emotion as a tool, his casual familiarity with matters she believed should remain sacred. And when he published his memoirs in 2010, including details of private conversations with her, the damage was sealed. For the Queen, who lived by the rule that the monarch speaks to no one and everyone at the same time, Blair's loose lips were a breach of royal contract. One does not summarize the Queen. One does not quote her. One does not, under any circumstances, put her words in a paperback sold at airport bookstores. She never confronted him. She never had to. Her displeasure was written in gestures, in the tightness of a smile, the brevity of a meeting, the disappearance of warmth that once came so easily. Blair, for all his modern flair, learned the hard way that innovation has its limits. And in the eyes of a monarch trained in the art of timeless restraint, charisma without reverence was simply noise. But here's the irony. He tried to modernize the crown, and yet he ended up proving exactly why it resists modernization. He revealed how fragile public opinion could be, how shallow modern affection really was, and how, in the face of crisis, the crown still had one advantage he could never possess: permanence. And so, Blair moved on. Another bright star that burned fast and faded into the back catalog of constitutional memory. But Elizabeth remained, watching, smiling, enduring, as she always had,